What exactly is a division? In this war so far, we've seen many different kinds of divisions fighting each other, but you wouldn't know that just from hearing their names and seeing them move on the map. The truth is that not all divisions are created equal. Some are larger, some smaller, some more complex than others. So today, I'm going to slice into the meat of the units fighting in Korea and show you what's going on under the surface. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is a Korean War in real-time special episode breaking down the anatomy of a division. Right off the bat, we need to talk about the benefits and limitations of using divisions to understand how armies work. I mean, it goes without saying that armies don't line up in perfectly neat little columns and wait for each other to have their full complement of men and equipment before opening fire. So that's really the big limitation here. Pretty much no division I'm mentioning in the regular episodes is ever actually fighting at its full desired strength. Even if it's their first major operation in months, Keith from 3rd Regiment is still going to be out of action with an ingrown toenail or something similarly mundane. It's better to understand a division as a blueprint. When you look at the list of men and equipment, that's what the division wants to have, the strength the army will try to bring it up to. Because of that, we also see a lot of variation in division size and structure between countries. There's no set rule for what a division should contain or what it should be able to do. It really depends on the military doctrine that nation is using and how they're trying to fight. That said, there's not really any other way of keeping tabs on the men who are doing the fighting. It strikes a delicate balance between simplicity and detail. It's not perfect by any means, but things on the battlefield are rarely perfect, and good enough will get the job done. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get on to our first combatant of the day, the United States. Thanks to the wealth of U.S. Army records and manuals available, we actually have almost an exact picture of what a division from the Korean War era should contain. This here is the Infantry Regiment Reference Handbook of May 1951, issued to the Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Breaking down the division tree, we can see the division at full strength consists of 17,214 personnel split among 3 regiments of 3,502 plus various support units. Notably, dedicated first aid units, mechanized or armored recon, and even a battalion of tanks attached. If you've watched our special on military symbology, which came out recently, you'll recall some of these symbols. This structure is what we generally refer to as a triangular division type because it's broken down into 3s. 3 regiments per division, 3 battalions per regiment, 3 companies per battalion. Actually, before World War II, a lot of divisions were square, broken down into 4. But as doctrine developed and more support companies became commonplace, it became easier to command and control 3 prongs of a trident rather than 4 prongs of a quadrant. Well, anyway, we can also see some equipment lists here, listing everything from radio sets to truck complements to 4 24 shower head bath units. Absolutely vital if you want to conduct operations cleanly. 6,849 of the old reliable M1 Garand, which sounds like a lot, but remember, the division has 34,428 thumbs, ideally, to start with. Also included are cameras, 7 typewriters, over 1,000 miles of wire and cables, 7,033 carbines, 72 howitzers, and 147 flag sets for good measure. Okay, a lot of what I'm mentioning probably sounds a bit unnecessary, but there is a point to talking about it. It's a reminder of just how much gear these guys have to pull around with them. It's easy to think of an infantry division as just men and rifles with a few tanks scattered in, but no, soldiers and officers live here, as well as fighting and dying here, and when their unit goes forward or pulls back, all of that needs to come with them. Now, not many U.S. infantry divisions in Korea really look as they ought to on paper, especially not in the early phases of the war. 8th Army was seriously lacking both men and equipment in June 1950 when things got going, and was quite a way short of being combat fit. The first few disastrous forays into combat actions against the North Korean KPA were more or less just hastily constructed task forces of green troops with missing or outdated equipment. It's not until many weeks later that U.S. divisions start looking like they should, and even longer until they can best their North Korean and Chinese adversaries. But speaking of those early makeshift units that were routed by the KPA, that's another interesting thing about the U.S. Army at this time. In Korea, we see the U.S. making use of something new: task forces and their cousins, the generally larger regimental combat teams, or RCTs. I mention RCTs quite often, so let me elaborate on what they are. They're basically an infantry regiment which has had additional support attached to it at the discretion of the divisional commander, normally extra tanks or artillery, but also occasionally other infantry battalions too, like the 23rd RCT at Cheopyeong-ni, which was augmented with the French battalion. This extra support would generally increase the size from 3,800 or so up to around 6,000, and give it everything it needs to conduct independent operations, almost turning it into a mini division in a way. They're semi-permanent and can be formed or disbanded as needed. As we've seen and will continue to see, RCTs have grown to be a big part of U.S. operations in Korea and add some real flexibility to the divisional structure. So who are they up against? The North Korean KPA and the Chinese PVA. KPA divisions at the start of the war resemble some older Soviet-style divisions, both in structure and equipment. These divisions are triangular too, and are composed of around 12,000 men total, split into 3 regiments of 2,794 men each, plus support units. These support units include recon, signals, an artillery regiment with plenty of howitzers and mortars, a handful of Soviet tanks, usually T-34-85s, and a healthy amount of anti-tank guns to round it off. All these numbers come from Appelman and Hickey, by the way. You can find their works in our source list in the video description. It's interesting, though, to really recognize what a serious force these units were in June 1950. They are no joke. Combat veterans sporting some hardcore equipment. The U.S. and South Korean failures early on are, of course, partially down to incompetence and a lack of readiness, but the KPA were a very real threat. After the failure of the Naktung offensive and the advance of 8th Army up to the Chongchon River, though, KPA units changed radically. Most of their more valuable equipment, like heavy artillery and tanks, had either been abandoned by necessity or picked off by UN air power, and divisions had to be reformed with whatever was available to them. This was especially true of the ones that failed to make it into Manchuria, who had to spend much of winter 1950 fighting in the hills as guerrillas. These newer KPA divisions contain inconsistent numbers of troops, often arranged into 2 regiments rather than 3, so as not to spread them too thinly. And they find themselves employed in subsidiary roles, supporting the more capable and complete divisions of the PVA. And how about those PVA divisions? Well, reliable information on those is a little harder to come by, but we can take the information we do have and infer more from their battlefield experiences. PVA divisions have a full strength of around 10,000 men, again with a general triangular structure. However, unlike their US and early KPA counterparts, PVA divisions are usually a lot lighter in terms of support equipment. Chinese soldiers in Korea make do with what they can carry, and we don't really see big supply trains following them. That is a blessing and a curse. They can operate independently against the UN forces, including well behind the lines in infiltration assaults. But when UN troops get them in a straight fight in open terrain, their lack of support gear really does start to show. They lack good amounts of heavy artillery to really challenge the UN batteries, but have access to lighter field guns and mortars, which they like to use to pin their enemy while the infantry works its way around them. There's a handful of tanks sprinkled in there, but really piecemeal and rare. Larger numbers of heavier tanks, including the Soviet-built IS-2 and IS-3, won't arrive in the PVA until much later in the war. Chinese divisions also really struggle with signals, and the UN forces have already been spared some likely defeats because of Chinese inability to communicate with each other and exploit favorable situations. But overall, we can see how the PVA have seen their inferiority of equipment and really built their divisions to minimize their disadvantages. The entire thing is set up around those sharp, morale-sapping, terrifying infantry assaults, with bugles and whistles blaring in the middle of the night. It's a structure which has been designed to maximize what they have. and it works incredibly well if they can break the nerve of their opponents. Finally, let's have a look at the South Korean ROK divisions and the 2 British and Commonwealth brigades. The ROK Army at the start of the war had 8 divisions, although only 5 of them had 3 operational regiments, and only the 1st, 6th, 7th, and Capital divisions were anywhere close to full strength. Full strength in this case is between 9,500 and 10,000, depending on whom you ask. Compared to their KPA adversaries, they were also very poorly equipped. Persistent shortages of spare parts for trucks and jeeps meant that ROK divisions lacked motorization and typically had to march around on foot. They also lacked armor, anti-tank weapons, and enough artillery to match the KPA. U.S. support does manage to mitigate these issues somewhat, and ROK divisions, backed by UN air power and artillery, turn out to be quite effective. Without that support, though, we've seen them stall on offense and collapse on defense. We really should not underestimate the psychological effects of getting mauled first by the KPA and then by the PVA, because ROK troops suffered from a crisis of confidence through the periods when the UN was on the back foot. The South Koreans have not been bad soldiers in this conflict, but inconsistent support, fighting much stronger opponents, and a few massive setbacks have really prevented them from performing at their best. Under the right circumstances, they've punched well above their weight. The Capital Division and the 1st Division during the defense of the Busan perimeter spring to mind. Where we are now in 1951, the ROK Army is still undergoing heavy reorganization and activation of new divisions sporting newer gear supplied by the US, so we will no doubt be seeing more and more of them in the months ahead. As for the British, what we now call the 27th Commonwealth Brigade began as a British brigade comprised of a battalion each from the Royal Leicestershire Regiment, Middlesex Regiment, and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. The brigade lacked effective transport at first, for some months, but did bring with them their own small arms, artillery, tank support, and anti-tank guns. It was then further augmented with the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, an Indian Field Ambulance Unit, an artillery regiment from New Zealand, and volunteers from British forces in Hong Kong, transforming it into a truly multinational force and prompting the name change. The 29th Brigade, which arrived piecemeal throughout the fall and winter of 1950, was slightly less of a mashup than its Commonwealth cousin and contained 3 battalions, one each from the Royal Ulster Rifles, 1st Gloucestershire Regiment, and Royal Northumberland Fusiliers. Unlike the more hastily deployed 27th Brigade, the 29th came with a full Royal Army Service Corps company to manage transport and supply. It was also backed by Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tanks and modern Centurions, which are deployed with great reluctance, the British fearing that one might fall into KPA or PVA hands and then be passed to the Soviets for reverse engineering. Well, that is quite a lot to digest, so we will leave it there for today. We talk about divisions so often as if they were just identical moving pieces on a chessboard, all equal and equitable, and if one division beats another, then that division is simply better. But in reality, that couldn't be further from the truth. Divisions are not created equal. A division is a piece of machinery, designed in such a way that it complements the strengths of the army it fights for. They're complex beasts, and that is worth remembering as we go week by week for however long this war lasts. And if you are following along with us week by week and enjoy seeing these bad boys in action, you can join the Time Ghost Army. You can join the Time Ghost Army at either timeghost.tv or patreon.com. It is the Time Ghost Army that makes all of this possible and allows us to keep bringing you specials like this one. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.